Man exploring an old cave uncovers strange markings with an ancient history. Historical sites are always intriguing. When stepping through ancient ruins or walking the lengths of a war-torn battlefield, it can feel impossible to ignore the weight of history. But just because you think you know everything about a historical location doesn't mean there aren't secrets hiding underfoot. One popular tourist location in the English countryside was crowded with spectators for centuries. But one realization from a first-time visitor unraveled an eerie past that might change the way people perceive this popular attraction forever. Subterranea Britannica is a society of like-minded people with a few common interests: abandoned mines, out-of-commission tube stations, and man-made caves. One particular group outing, the UK-based group, included two below-ground buffs who'd done their homework. Haley Clark and Ed Waters brought their expertise of ancient history, along with remarkable attention to detail, on an important excursion. Together, the Sub-Brits, as they are known, made their way to the British Midlands. They were headed towards Cresswell Crags, a limestone gorge with a series of archaic caves last inhabited over 10,000 years ago. Just a few steps into the entrance of what is known as the Robin Hood Cave, Haley and Ed stopped abruptly. Then the pair dashed straight to the rocky walls and ran their hands over the cool surface. They'd made a gripping discovery. Covering vast stretches of the limestone interior walls were countless scratches and carvings, undoubtedly thousands of years old. The markings were obvious, the first thing you'd notice when entering the cave. To the untrained eye, they were also totally insignificant. For years, locals and facility workers believed that the carvings on the walls were meaningless scrawlings, graffiti dating back to the Victorian period. Every passerby through the cave noticed them, but no one had ever recognized what they truly were. Until Haley and Ed noticed their markings. The hidden meaning was overlooked for centuries. Hundreds of individual characters were etched into the surface, but what pulled them away from the wonder of the tour were two letters: VV. Immediately, Haley and Ed knew the letters represented a phrase that carried a curious weight. VV stood for Virgin of Virgins, a prayer beseeching Mary of Nazareth for protection against dark forces. The VV annotations were repeated dozens of times on any surface the carvers could reach. Haley and Ed shared their findings with the rest of the tour group. Their guide, heritage facilitator John Charlesworth, was gobsmacked. He notified the Cresswell Heritage Trust at once, and experts were called in to examine the symbols. They scoured every inch of the caves. Even in the hard-to-reach nooks and crannies, they found hastily made inscriptions. Crosses, maze patterns, and boxes were repeated ceremoniously, just like the religious VV pleading. Apparently, these kinds of messages were used to trick and subsequently trap evil spirits. With the serious and dramatic meanings of the markings finally understood, there was a giant red flag. What were all of these people afraid of? Clearly, a dark force had driven them to a desperate state to carve symbols on the walls of a cave for help. Answering the question started by identifying the persons responsible for the carvings. Alison Fern, a PhD of archaeology at the University of Leicester, claimed that these apotropaic markings are usually associated with places of worship or the doorframes of the home. Spending hours a day chiseling into stone, back when it would be slow, painstaking work, is the act of someone in fear. The root cause of such panic has something to do with the other common name for apotropaic markings: witch marks. Historians from Cresswell Heritage teamed up with Historic England and determined the markings date back to between the 14th and 18th centuries and attributed their carvings to residents of nearby Cresswell. There's no way to prove indefinitely that the citizens of Cresswell were suffering from a real-life version of the witch, but the sheer quantity of the markings means something spooky was going down. Connections between nature and the supernatural go back centuries, and in a setting plucked out of the pages of a fantasy novel, with cliffs and a picturesque lake, anyone could see how the caves could exude power. It's also possible the villagers were facing merciless diseases or debilitating poverty and blamed a witch. Taking to the caves to perform a ritual, saving themselves from unknown despair, could have been their last straw. No matter what the cause, the caves at Cresswell Crag represented an overwhelming visual depiction of something sinister. When understanding of the markings swept the tour group, everybody felt a prickle of fear. "It was like something from The Shining," said the director of the Cresswell Crags Museum and Heritage Center, Paul Baker, after entering the cave armed with his new knowledge about the innumerable symbols. Cresswell Crag has the highest number of recorded apotropaic markings for any location in Britain, but in fact, many other creepy discoveries have been made throughout the historically dense English landscape. Christopher Woodward, museum director for London's Garden Museum, envisioned beautiful renovations to the centuries-old building he operated, so naturally, he panicked when site manager Carl Patton called him with an ominous request. "I think you better come here quickly," Carl told Christopher over the phone. It sounded like bad news, and given the history of the building, there was a lot that could go wrong. For instance, the museum was located within the medieval church St. Mary at Lambeth, not far from the River Thames. Beside it was the residence of the Archbishop of Canterbury, and across the river was Westminster Abbey, both priceless structures. Had the construction damaged something irreplaceable? Christopher arrived at the museum, and Carl explained the situation. "We were exposing the ground as part of this job," he said, "and we uncovered an entry to what looked like a tomb." Christopher's mind was racing. Uncovering a tomb should have been impossible. Christopher explained, "We were told there was no crypt because it was so close to the Thames. It would have flooded. And in the 1850s, they cleared out hundreds, if not thousands, of coffins to install underfloor heating. So what the heck had Carl found?" Putting safety first, Carl, on the right, retrieved a camera, attached it to the end of a stick, and lowered it into the chamber. Then, from the ground level, the men peered into the lower level of the church. Down through the hatch were more than a dozen coffins, 30 to be exact. More curious than the coffins themselves, however, was the brilliant object that was perched atop one of them. Christopher was floored. "I came in thinking this phone call sounds like bad news, a problem, and wow, and it's a crown! It's the mitre of an archbishop gleaming there in the dark, but somehow that wasn't the most impressive discovery." Among the coffins discovered in the lower-level crypt were those of 5 archbishops, all of whom had extensive and historically impactful resumes to their names. One coffin, for instance, bore a plaque with the name John Moore. John Moore served as archbishop from 1783 to 1805. Described as amiable, he led movements in support of Sunday schools and missionary enterprises. Still, historians working on the project were drawn to one coffin in particular. Along with Archbishops Thomas Tennyson, left, who reigned from 1695 to 1715, Matthew Hutton, 1757 to 1758, and Frederick Cornwallis, 1768 to 1783, Christopher discovered the remains of Archbishop Richard Bancroft on the right. You might be familiar with his work. Archbishop Bancroft served from 1604 to 1610. During his tenure, he oversaw the writing and publishing of the King James translation of the Holy Bible. Historians involved in the project couldn't contain their excitement. To know that possibly the person that commissioned the King James Bible is buried here is the most incredible discovery, Wesley Kerr, a historian and horticulturist, said. It greatly adds to the texture of this project, and yet the crypt contained more than its share of mysteries, too. We still don't know who else is down there, Christopher said, as the contents of all 30 coffins hadn't been identified. Still, the church's history might have held some answers. more archbishops and their families. This church had two lives, Christopher said. It was the parish church of Lambeth, but it was also a kind of annex to Lambeth Palace itself. Over the centuries, a significant number of archbishops chose to worship and be buried. Perhaps most amazing of all, however, was that by all accounts, this discovery should have never been possible. Every archaeologist in London has looked in this building, Christopher said, but nobody told us to expect us to find anything. As for Christopher's findings, he didn't have any grand plans to remove the coffins or crown. To respect the dead, he and the Garden Museum left the bodies right where they were, though he didn't shut them away completely from the public eye. Once the 18-month, £7.5 million redevelopment project was completed in 2017, the Garden Museum presented a single pane of glass that would cover the entry to the tomb. So what did that mean for Garden Museum patrons? It meant that as they pursued the museum and inspected installations that beautifully captured bits and pieces of London's colorful history, they too could stumble upon the hidden crypt of the archbishops.